For the first time in 4 years, I laughed at something stupid. A pigeon walked into the coffee shop, looked around like it owned the place, and waddled back out. And I laughed, actually laughed, until my eyes watered. The woman at the next table stared at me. I didn't care. I sat there with my cheap drip coffee and my laugh lines, and I thought, I'm okay. I'm actually okay. Let me tell you how I got here. I met my husband when I was 22. I was working the front desk at a small accounting firm in Columbus, Ohio. Nothing glamorous, just answering phones and filing, trying to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. He came in for a meeting with one of the senior partners. He was 30, wore a navy blazer that fit him perfectly, and he smiled at me when he signed in like I was the only person in the room. His name was Garrett. He owned 2 restaurant locations at the time. Casual dining, nothing fancy, but they were his, and he was proud of them in a way I found genuinely charming. He talked about his regulars by name. He knew which cook had a sick mother and which server was saving for college. I thought that meant he was a good person. I think I was right for a while. People can be good and still do terrible things. That's the part nobody warns you about. We dated for 18 months. He proposed at a little Italian place downtown, no flash mob, no hidden cameras, just him across a small table with a drink he'd picked out himself. My mother cried. His mother, Patrice. Wait, no. I need to use different names. His mother, whose name I will not use here because this is my story, not hers, hugged me at the engagement party and said welcome to the family like she meant it. I believed her. I believed all of it. We got married the following October. I was 24, he was 32. Within a year, I left the accounting firm and started managing the books for his restaurants. It made sense. I had the background, we were trying to save on overhead, and honestly, I liked being close to what he was building. By the time we hit our 3rd anniversary, he'd opened 2 more locations. 4 restaurants, a small catering arm, and a commercial kitchen he leased out on weekends to a local bakery. I handled all of it. The payroll, the vendor contracts, the franchise compliance filings, the quarterly tax prep. I knew every number, every account, every line item. I also knew by our 5th year of marriage that something was wrong. Not with the business, with us. He started working later. I told myself it was the expansion. He'd just signed a lease on a 5th location across town. He started being quieter at dinner. I told myself he was tired. He started leaving his phone face down on the counter. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't being paranoid. Her name was Simone. She was a regional marketing consultant he'd hired to rebrand 2 of the locations. I found out the way a lot of women find out. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in pieces. A name that came up too often. A receipt for dinner at a place he'd never mentioned. A shift in the way he talked about his day, like he was editing himself. I didn't confront him right away. I know that sounds strange. But I'd been doing the books for 4 years. I'd been dealing with numbers my whole professional life. And I knew, instinctively, in the way you know when something doesn't add up, that if I confronted him too soon, I'd lose leverage I didn't even fully understand yet. So I waited, and I watched, and I kept doing my job. What I found, over the next several months, was worse than the affair. The 5th location he'd leased, he'd done it without telling me, and he'd used a line of credit I didn't know existed, tied to the business LLC. He'd also, and this took me a while to piece together, been quietly renegotiating vendor contracts, routing payments through a second account I didn't have access to, and cutting corners on health code compliance at 2 locations in ways that had already drawn routings from the county. He was building something, but he was also destroying something. And he thought I didn't see it. I saw everything. I opened my own savings account that fall. Personal, separate, nothing connected to any of our joint accounts or the business. I started moving a portion of my pay, I was technically on payroll as the business manager, into that account each month. Not a dramatic amount. Enough. I also called a lawyer, not a divorce lawyer, not yet. A business attorney, specifically someone who handled franchise compliance and commercial real estate. I told her I was doing due diligence on the company structure. She helped me understand very clearly exactly what the outstanding compliance issues meant for the franchise agreements. What it meant was this: two of the four franchise locations were in material breach of their licensing agreements. If the franchisor conducted an audit, which they were legally entitled to do at any time, those locations could lose their operating licenses. The leases would still be owed. The staff would still need to be paid out. The liability would not disappear. It would just no longer come with any revenue to offset it. I sat with that information for 3 months. I filed the compliance reports as required. I did not fix the underlying violations. I was the business manager. Fixing operation violations wasn't my job. That was management. That was him. He never asked. I also, during this time, spoke with a family law attorney, quietly through a friend who worked in a different city. I asked hypothetical questions about what happens to business assets in an Ohio divorce. I asked about what factors a court considers when dividing a jointly operated business. I asked about the difference between marital debt and separate debt. I listened carefully. I did not write anything down during those meetings. I wrote things down later, alone, in a notebook I kept in my car. Then one evening in March, my husband came home, poured himself a drink, and told me he wanted a divorce. He was calm, practiced. He'd clearly been thinking about this for a while. He said he wasn't happy. He said we'd grown apart. He said he hoped we could be civil. Then he said, and this is the part that still makes me exhale slowly when I think about it. He said he'd already spoken to an attorney, and he wanted to keep the business. All of it, all four locations. The catering arm, the leased kitchen, the equipment, the brand, the accounts. He said I could keep my car. He'd be generous with support, he said. He used that word, generous, like he was doing me a favor. I looked at him across our kitchen island and I said, okay. He blinked. He'd been expecting a fight. I could see it. Okay, he said. I trust you, I said. If you think that's fair. He didn't know what to do with that. He nodded slowly and said he'd have his lawyer send over the initial paperwork. I smiled and said that was fine. Then I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and gave myself exactly 10 minutes to feel every terrible thing I was feeling. I cried. I punched a pillow twice. I thought about the October wedding and the way his mother had hugged me, and every dinner I'd ever cooked in that house. I gave myself 10 minutes, and then I stopped. I washed my face. I went back downstairs and made tea. That was the last time I cried about Garrett for a very long time. His attorney made the first offer within 2 weeks. It was almost exactly what he'd described. He'd take the business in full. I'd receive a settlement amount that was frankly insulting given the years I'd put in, and we'd split the equity in the house 50-50. My attorney, a woman named Delphine, looked at the offer and then looked at me. I told her I wanted to accept it. She put her pen down. Claire, she said, that's not my real name, but that's what I'll call myself here. Claire, you have 4 years of documented contributions to this business. You're listed as the business manager on every tax filing. You could make a very strong argument for a significant share of the business valuation. I said I understood that. She said the business is valued at roughly $1.8 million based on the most recent assessment. Your proposed settlement is $220,000. That is not equitable. I said I understood that too. Why? She asked. I slid a folder across the desk. Inside were the county health inspection records for locations 2 and 4, the written warnings, the unresolved violations, a copy of the franchise agreement with the relevant breach clauses highlighted, and a summary I'd prepared, careful, factual, dated, of the secondary account, the undisclosed line of credit, and the outstanding balance on the 5th location's lease, which had not yet opened and was already 6 weeks behind on build-out. Delphine read through it slowly. When she looked up, her expression had changed. If the franchisor audits, I said, they will find the violations. The agreement gives them 90 days to cure or terminate. Based on the operational state of both locations, I do not believe he can cure within 90 days. What's the total liability exposure if both licenses are terminated? She asked. Between the lease obligations, the outstanding vendor contracts, and the payroll continuation requirements under Ohio law, I said. Approximately $1.1 million. Against remaining business assets, equipment, brand, the two compliant locations of maybe 400,000. Net negative position. She was quiet for a moment. He doesn't know, she said. He hasn't asked, I said. You've been filing compliance reports. I've been doing my job, I said, accurately. There was a very long pause. And the house equity, she asked. I want the house equity, she asked. I want the house, I said. Full equity. And I want the settlement amount adjusted to cover my legal fees. That's it? That's it. She looked at me for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then she said, all right. The negotiation took 6 weeks. Garrett's attorney pushed back on the house. Garrett wanted to sell it and split the proceeds. My attorney said that was fine, but noted that we'd be requesting a full independent valuation of the business, at which point the compliance records would become part of discovery. Garrett's attorney asked for a week. He came back and agreed to the house. I signed the business over to Garrett on a Tuesday. His attorney was there, mine was there, Garrett was there. He shook my attorney's hand and he looked at me once, and I could see he was relieved. He thought he'd gotten what he wanted. The audit request from the franchisor arrived 14 weeks later. I know this because Delphine told me. She'd done a little investigating of her own, apparently. The franchisor had received an anonymous tip about the compliance issues. I don't know anything about that. What I do know is that Garrett's attorney called Delphine in a panic, asking whether I had any liability exposure for the business issues given my role as former business manager. Delphine explained patiently that I had resigned my position prior to the finalization of the divorce, and that all operational decisions since then had been made by the sole owner, my ex-husband. The call was apparently very short after that. I heard through a mutual friend, someone who still kept in touch with people in Garrett's circle, that he eventually settled with the franchisor. He had to close both locations under the compliance violations, absorb the lease penalties, and negotiate a payment plan on the undisclosed line of credit that I had, naturally, disclosed to my attorney as part of discovery. Simone apparently had stopped returning his calls sometime around month 4 of the whole process. I don't feel good about that. I want to be honest about that. I don't feel triumphant. I feel tired, mostly. And something else that's harder to name. Not quite relief. More like the way the air feels after a long storm. I have the house. I repainted the living room a color I'd wanted since we moved in, but he'd said was too bold. It's a deep terracotta, almost rust. It's the first thing I see every morning. I still do accounting work, consulting now on my own schedule. I have 4 clients, 3 of whom are women who own small businesses and need someone to help them understand their own numbers. I care about that more than I expected to. I've thought a lot about what I'd tell someone who's sitting where I was sitting 4 years ago, watching the receipts and the silences and the face-down phone, and trying to decide what to do. I'd tell them this: know your numbers. Not his numbers, yours. Your name on what accounts. Your name off what debts. What you've contributed, documented and provable. Keep a record not because you're planning to leave, but because information is the only thing that is entirely yours regardless of what anyone else decides to do. My grandmother used to say that a woman without her own money is a woman at someone else's mercy. I used to think that was old-fashioned. I know now that it is simply true. I also know this: the quietest version of strength is the most underestimated kind. Garrett expected a fight. He braced for yelling, for accusations, for a lawyer letter that rattled the windows. He got a woman who said okay and went upstairs and cried into a pillow for 10 minutes. He should have been more worried about the 10 minutes. The pigeon came back into the coffee shop this morning. Different day, same pigeon. Or maybe a different one, I can't tell. It looked around the same way, walked back out. I laughed again. It's small, I know, but small things are what I have right now, and I have learned very recently, and at considerable cost, that small things are more than enough. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this ended. Not in any grand cosmic sense. I'm not someone who believes the universe was keeping score on my behalf. But I do believe that most outcomes in life are not random. They are the accumulated result of choices made quietly over time by people who either paid attention or didn't. Garrett didn't pay attention. That's the honest truth of it. He had access to the same information I had. He signed the same tax returns. His name was on the same LLC. But he had decided at some point that the numbers were my job and the decisions were his. And that clean division of labor made him feel powerful, I think. In control. Like a man who had built something. What it actually made him was dependent on a person he was planning to leave, without ever considering what that person might know. That's not me being cruel. That's just what happened. I think about ethics a lot now, more than I expected to. Whether what I did was right. I kept filing accurate compliance reports. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't lie to anyone. I simply stopped fixing problems that were not mine to fix. And I made sure my own position was clean and documented before anyone started asking questions. Was that fair? I think it was. I also think fairness is a more complicated word than most people treat it as. What I didn't do, and this matters to me, was act out of anger. There were nights early on when I wanted to blow the whole thing up just to watch it burn. Call the franchisor myself. Send documents to people who didn't need to receive them. Make noise. But anger is loud, and loud is sloppy, and sloppy is how you lose things you've worked for. I chose quiet instead. I chose patience. I chose patience. I chose to understand exactly what I had before I decided what to do with it. That's the thing I'd want someone in a similar place to hear. Your intelligence is a resource, not just your education or your credentials, but the specific, particular knowledge you have accumulated from living your actual life. I knew those restaurant books better than anyone. I had built that compliance filing system from scratch. That knowledge belonged to me as much as it belonged to the business. And when the business stopped being mine, the knowledge stayed. Garrett underestimated that. A lot of people underestimate that in women, the quiet accumulation of expertise that happens when someone shows up every day and does their job well and doesn't make a lot of noise about it. They see the absence of noise and assume the absence of substance. That is a mistake I would not make twice if I were them. And the resilience part. I want to be careful about how I talk about this because I don't think I was heroic. I cried into a pillow. I drove around the block twice before going into my lawyer's office the first time because I didn't trust my own face to stay composed. I ate cereal for dinner more nights than I'm going to admit. Resilience, for me, was not dramatic. It was just continuing. Making the next appointment, opening the next spreadsheet, painting the living room a color I wanted. One thing, then the next thing. The terracotta wall is still the first thing I see in the morning. I chose it. That still matters.